I think a company like Tempest has the ability to like quite literally impact global survival rates of the species by like a decade.
One of the things that we always liked about Amazon was that the technology that powered its storefront got more powerful and cheaper every year. And I think you have a similar dynamic at play with Tempest.
I suspect one day, and I don't know if Tempest will be that company, but I suspect one day there will be a Tempest-like company that is every bit as big as Apple or Google or Amazon or Nvidia or whatever.
Healthcare is the biggest industry in the world. It's, if you can actually, if this technology is going to be impactful in the world, then it has to be impactful in healthcare.
Hello, and welcome to Season 3 of Invest in Progress, brought to you by the Scottish Mortgage team. I'm Claire Shaw, Portfolio Director. In this podcast, we take you behind the scenes to hear the conversations that take place between the Scottish mortgage managers and the leaders of some of the world's most exceptional growth companies. As we are a UK investment trust, we can only market Scottish Mortgage to certain audiences and in certain jurisdictions. Check out the podcast description to ensure this content is suitable for you. And, as with any investment, your capital is at risk. On today's episode, we explore the transformative journey of Tempus AI, founded by Eric Lefkofsky. In 2014, Eric's wife was diagnosed with cancer, and Eric was shocked by the lack of information from previous patients being used to inform her treatment. A successful tech entrepreneur at the time, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Eric and his team collected and analysed data and built a tool to make sense of it. He then changed his wife's treatment plan to make it more personalised to her individual case. And it worked. The solution is now known as Tempus AI, the company revolutionising healthcare through big data and artificial intelligence. It has built one of the largest libraries of oncology data and uses it to personalise cancer diagnosis and treatment at enormous scale. The platform also shares data with pharmaceutical companies, enabling drug discovery and speeding up the notoriously slow process of getting new treatments to market. Scottish Mortgage first invested in Tempus AI as a private company back in 2018, and we continued our support when it went public on the Nasdaq in June 2024. So today we are thrilled to have Eric on the podcast to share his plans to save the global healthcare industry trillions of dollars and, most importantly, continue saving lives. After Eric's conversation with Scottish Mortgage manager Tom Slater, I'll delve deeper into the investment case with Tom. But for now, let's hear from Tom and Eric.
Welcome, Eric. Thank you for joining us. So before we dive deeper into the company, can you give our listeners the Tempus AI 101? What does the company do?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So Tempest is focused on this idea of AI-enabled diagnostics, or how do you make diagnostics intelligent? So diagnostics, for those that don't know, are essentially any kind of laboratory test result or similar result that would be ordered typically by a physician when treating a patient. So blood tests, CAT scans, MRIs, molecular tests. And we started thinking, or I started thinking about 9 years ago when I started Tempest, that if you could make these diagnostics intelligent, if you could kind of wrap the benefits of artificial intelligence around them and contextualize diagnostics specifically for the patient for whom they were ordered. If you could connect those two, you could help physicians figure out how to make data-driven decisions and how to navigate patients to the optimal therapeutic, getting the right drug at the right time. And you could then, in some ways, infuse the benefits of technology and artificial intelligence into the healthcare system by kind of sneaking it in through the diagnostics that are routinely ordered.
And if you could take us back to the start, Eric, it's an incredibly personal and moving story behind the motivation to create the company. So could you start by outlining the circumstances which led you to establishing Tempest?
Yeah, in my case, I was a tech guy. I had been in technology since 1999, so I was there from the earliest, before the first internet bubble burst. And I never thought I would get into healthcare. But about 10 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so, I had spent a lot of time involved in her care as any, husband would. And I was kind of amazed at how little data and technology were a part of her care and a part of really anyone that was being treated with cancer. And so I started thinking, this is crazy that we're, giving, truck drivers that are delivering, pallets of water bottles, more technology than we're giving physicians who are making life and death decisions. And at the time, genomic sequencing was a fairly new thing. We had sequenced the genome about 20 years ago. So about 10 years ago, the cost was just starting to come down and people were doing it a bit more routinely in the United States. And the challenge was this data was coming back and it was incredibly complicated. There was lots of data. What mutations does a patient have? What's going on at a genetic level? And physicians were having a really hard time interpreting this data and personalizing it around that patient, right? So, for example, let's say a patient has a mutation. Let's say they have a PIK3CA mutation, which is a gene that might be mutated. If I recommend a drug like everolimus, when you get a report back, it says, patient X has a PIK3CA mutation, and therefore there's in our case, let's say it's an FDA-approved drug called everolimus that you should think of taking. Well, if the patient already took that 2 years ago or 3 years ago in a prior line of therapy and failed, it's a really bad recommendation, right? You're kind of sending a doctor down a wild goose chase. And I was amazed at the fact that these reports were coming back with all this information, but they had no idea who my wife was. They didn't know if she was male or female or old or young, didn't know what drug she had taken. Even the clinical trials they were recommending, I was thinking, like, this is crazy. They're recommending trials. But let's say one of the first criteria of the trial is that you can't be a cigarette smoker. Well, what if a patient smokes 2 packs a day, right? Like, it's a terrible recommendation to make. So I started thinking, why don't we know who the patient is? Like, why are we running all these very sophisticated, expensive laboratory tests or genomic tests? And we have no idea who the patient is. And the reason is because all that healthcare data of who the patient is, what drugs they've taken, how they've responded, who they are, their characteristics, it's all locked inside these typically antiquated systems. And the data is siloed. It's unstructured, it's siloed, it's messy. But what had happened around the time my wife was diagnosed is that these background technologies were emerging, like natural language processing and optical character recognition and cloud computing, and most recently, obviously, large language models. But you had all these background technologies evolving that were making it so that you could structure all this messy, siloed data about who these patients were. And you could actually, at very low cost and very high quality, build almost a vignette of these patients in real time. And therefore, when you ran the test, a genomic test, whatever the test was, you could marry them. We had the technology tools to allow you to marry them and generate insights. And that gave rise to Tempest.
And after you'd come to this realization, how did you approach the task of scaling it into a solution that could help millions of patients requiring cancer care or care more broadly?
Yeah, it's funny when we started Tempest, I was thinking a lot about how do you personalize these diagnostic results? How do you make genomic tests in cancer intelligent, and how do you bring the benefits of AI to these tests? But I wasn't thinking about opening up a lab. In fact, I'm like, I don't know how to open up a lab and sequence patients. So I went to the big sequencers at the time, the people who sequenced patients, and I said to them, "Look, I'm a tech. I understand technology. I'm a tech guy. Like I built a series of technology companies. I think I can solve this problem, but I didn't know how to generate the molecular data." And so I went to people who did that and said, "Hey, let's partner." And they all said to me, no, there's no way. You're never going to get our data. We would never give it to you. And they also said, and if you try to open up a lab and go to hospitals, they'll never give you the clinical data. So you're like, nice idea, rich guy, but it's never going to fly. And so we're like, okay, let's open up a lab. I mean, we can't, nothing we could do. No one's going to give us the data. So we started building a lab. We started hiring people that knew how to sequence patients, hiring medical directors and pathologists, and we built a lab. And it was a very small lab. And we went to a few hospitals and said, look, we're sequencing patients. We've opened up a lab that's certified and we have expertise and we're sequencing patients. And we think this is the solution to this problem. You're going to need someone like us to make these tests intelligent, and your doctors are going to be overwhelmed if we don't do this. And we were very fortunate that we had a few early adopters, and that's typically how tech companies tend to get off the ground. Is you have one or two clients that believe that you've identified a pain point. It's something that's really miserable that they're having a hard time with, and they're willing to take a shot that this new company can solve it. And so in our case, that was Northwestern Medical Medicine, which is here in Chicago. And we knew some people there. So we were a trusted, at least a trusted, there was some trust. And we began sequencing some of their patients and building out this technology and connecting the two. And then we landed another client, and it began to scale. And the business really scaled because our genomic tests were more personalized and more intelligent and had the benefits of technology embedded within them. They were more comprehensive, more intelligent. And so pretty soon, more and more hospitals began ordering our tests. And that's really how we scaled, as we became the largest sequencer of cancer patients in the U.S. And that kind of that fueled the adoption of all of our other products.
So I'm going to read out some statistics to illustrate what that ambitious idea nearly a decade ago has achieved to date. So you now have one of the largest libraries of clinical oncology data in the world, a database of over 7 million cancer patients' records. 50% of US oncologists, that's cancer doctors, are connected to the Tempest platform. You work with 19 of the 20 largest public pharmaceutical companies. Something like 190 petabytes of data. And if you're anything like me, you'd have used a chat GPT to give a real world example of what the 190 petabytes of data looks like. And that's approximately 57 billion songs in MP3 format, or 51 billion digital photos. So the bottom line is Tempest has a lot of data, and you've integrated it from many forms and sources. But taking a step back, there's always been a lot of data in healthcare. The issue has been that doctors have been unable to use it to improve patient care. It's back to the silos that you talked about, the fact that it's unstructured, it's unconnected. So can you elaborate a bit on how Tempest is fixing that problem? And what are the benefits that then materialize from you fixing those data pipes?
Yeah, and I think that you're. By the way, certainly the scale is. It's been nice to watch it grow and to see the adoption and to get to this point. But underlying all of this, and I think the last word you use is the key word, are these pipes. So the way to think about it is, in the United States, there are roughly 5,500 hospitals, give or take. And we are connected now to something like 26 or 2,700. So about half of all hospitals in the United States. And what we've done is we started in cancer. We've migrated to a few other disease areas like cardiology and neuropsych. But we started in cancer, and we began building these two-way connections, or these data pipes, where hospitals could send us data for their cancer patients. We could generate some diagnostic result, like we could run a next generation sequencing assay, or we could run a hereditary screening genetic test, or whatever the test is we're running, and we can marry the two together in real time, like literally in the same number of days it takes to run the test, we could bring the data in, run the test, connect it to, generate insights that are specific to that patient, and then return the result to the physician through those same pipes. So the doctor had his or her order, what the results of that order for that patient, and it was actually contextualized around that patient. So the way to think about it is, it's a bit like, almost like Tempest is a cable company, right? We back in the 1980s, we just ran around and started wiring up cable, and now we're connected to all these hospitals, and through those connections, not only can we bring that messy clinical data out so we can structure it and make sense of it, not only can we generate a diagnostic insights and put those insights back into the hospital, but those same pipes can be used to really distribute any form of AI insights that we generate. So let's say, for example, we see a patient who's a perfect fit for a clinical trial, we can use those same pipes to notify the physician. Let's say we see a patient that for some reason is falling through a care gap. It would have been the standard of care to order a particular test. Someone made a mistake and never ordered it. Or the patient should have gotten a particular dose. Someone made a mistake and they're getting a different dose. Like, we can actually see these care gaps in real time and then send automated algorithmic alerts or insights to these physicians to say, hey, you may want to consider this. It looks like your patient would benefit. And so now that we have these pipes, that's really the foundation upon which we are able to kind of bring AI to the U.S. healthcare system. And now we have to think a lot about how do we build those same pipes in Europe, in Asia, and around the world.
So you've talked us through the initial ambition to be a data company, and this realization that you'd have to actually generate a lot of this data yourself and do the testing. And so the genomics is your largest division today, about two-thirds of the revenue of the company. I think you've sort of talked to it in what you've been saying just now, but I guess just to make it explicit, it's probably fair to say that the accuracy of the tests that you do is relatively similar to your competitors. The reimbursement rates are about the same. So what is it about Tempest's value proposition that enables you to win in that testing market?
Yeah, I think, look, it's interesting, you guys are, I think we're large shareholders, still are in Tesla, I think. Yep. And I'll use the Tesla example just because I think it's really interesting. So if I have, by the way, I have a Tesla, so I can say
Me too.
I say this with firsthand. Okay, so if I handed you two EVs, let's say 5 years ago, and you're like, here's a Tesla, and here's a Ford, a Volt or something, pickup. On their face, you'd say, well, both have four wheels and both use a battery and both deliver similar results. I can get from point A to point B the exact same way. So these things are basically pretty similar. And there are lots of people who buy a Volt, and they might, for whatever reason, they like that car. But for people that, if you looked at Tesla's growth, you'd say, well, something's different about this Tesla car because it's capturing a vast amount of the EV market share. And at the end of the day, I think that we could talk about all the different things that are in that car, but it really comes down to a technological advantage. The technology wrapped around that Tesla was just demonstrably better than other EVs 5 or 10 years ago, which led, I think, in large part to their growth. And it's the same thing with Tempest. We have a technological advantage over our competitors. It's not that you can't get a perfectly good result from somebody else that's sequencing. You can order a test, and if you're just looking for the top 100 genes that might be mutated, you can order a Foundation One test and they'll deliver you those results. You can order Caris or Guardant and whatever. They're all 100% perfectly fine. But we have a lot of technology that is wrapped around our tests, how we're integrated with electronic healthcare record systems, how we personalize these tests by matching them to clinical data, other insights that we can derive that other people just can't because of how much money we've invested in all these algorithmic diagnostics that sit on top. our ability to route patients to the right clinical trial, our ability to close care gaps. Like, there's a lot of technology. And so I think for physicians who choose us over other people, and clearly doctors have chosen Tempest over others over the last, the company Tempest is 9 years old. We opened the lab about 7 years ago, something like that. And we become the largest sequencer. So we've grown much faster than our competition, who on average has been sequencing twice as long as us. These companies have been in market for 10 or 15 years. So more and more physicians have migrated to Tempest because of that technology advantage. And I think it's often hard to describe, because it isn't like we do one thing better. In the same way, for example, when Google launched Google, there was Lycos and Alta Vista and whatever, and they were all perfectly good search engines. It's just that Google was better. It rendered more accurate results, and so over some period of time, we all started using Google.
And if we extend your analogy with Tesla, the driver of the Tesla, in your case, is the physician, and one of the ways that they interface with Tempest is with your smart reports. So I've had a look at your smart reports. Even to a non-physician, I can quickly see why, if you're seeing 20 to 25 patients a day, that this solution would allow you to do your job faster and more easily. So can you describe to listeners what a smart report looks like and what it provides to a physician, how it differs from what a physician would have had before you?
Yeah, it's really it's really hard for me because first, Tempest is the beneficiary of all these kind of background technologies that have been transformational. And by the way, none of which we developed, all of which we're benefiting from, all of which were are these kind of like amazing strokes of luck that just befell upon us. None of these technologies, which are incredible, including low-cost molecular profiling and cloud computing, none of them are as transformational as a generative AI. These large language models and large image models and all the derivatives are so fundamentally transformative that what's funny is when someone says to me, "Can we talk about how smart your reports are today?" All I can think about is how dumb they are compared to how smart they're about to be. And so the reports, which are smart today in that you can when you order a Tempest report, it comes back personalized around your patient. So as I mentioned a minute ago, it doesn't recommend the wrong drug or the wrong trial. But what's also pretty awesome is we launched the first version of our AI agent called Tempest 1, which is embedded into the tools that doctors use, because you are right, they're the drivers of the Tesla in this example. And a doctor can ask Tempest 1 a myriad of questions. It could say, what mutations were found for my patient, or what's the recommended therapy for those patients? If there's a recommended therapy, it can say, what does the FDA warning label say for adverse events for that drug? Or where's that clinical trial open? Or what's the phone number for that trial? Or is there a known side effect if I give these two drugs together? Right? So it can ask an enormous number of questions and get answers. But as these models evolve, whether it's Gemini 2.0, whether it's GPT 4.0 or 01, whether it's the latest version of Llama, our ability to make these tests super intelligent is in the near term horizon, where you'll be able to order a Tempest test, get it back, and literally it's as if the totality of medical knowledge is just going to be sitting on top of that test result, where you can basically ask it anything, and if it's known today, you'll have that insight at the palm of your hand. And so, I would say Tempest tests are smart today, but over the next year or so are going to get incredibly smart.
And is that ease of use, that ability to interface, so that is that I mean, we can see how that could ultimately improve outcomes for patients. And is that part of the explanation of as to why you've just grown so much faster than the rest of the market? That it's you're making physicians' lives easier.
Yeah, I think the reason why our genomics business has grown is certainly because we're making physicians' lives easier. We're helping them get the right information at the right time, and our technology helps them manage the complexity of that information in a way that allows them to do their job quicker and easier and more efficient. So that's why doctors order our tests. The way that what happens is, to do that, we have to marry clinical and molecular data together. We were fortunate that I think we realized early on, if you de-identify that data, it's very valuable because it's at scale and it's coming from all this real world clinical interaction, right? So it's very valuable to biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies. And so early on, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we began to build technology tools to make that data useful, so people could license it, they could interrogate it, they could analyze it. And that began to take off. And so all of a sudden we had this fairly large data business, which also was growing rapidly and generating high margins. And so then what happened is the combination of our genomics business, which was growing and becoming more profitable, and the data business was growing and becoming more profitable. All of a sudden, we were generating lots of gross profit, hundreds of millions of dollars of gross profit that we could reinvest in, technology, in our AI, in some of the models we've been talking about. And so we built this kind of self-sustaining machine that's generating hundreds of millions of gross profit that we can reinvest in AI. And that, to me, is like the biggest hurdle you have to get over, because what ends up happening is you can have all these audacious ideas to bring AI to healthcare, but if you can't invest in them, it doesn't really scale. So we now have been able to build a machine that scales.
So I'd like to explore the AI side more, but before we do, I just want to go back to something you mentioned there. One of the business model advantages that you have is that you can package up that data that you're generating, that you're combining with the data from physicians, and sell it to pharmaceutical companies to help facilitate drug discovery. And you have partnerships with familiar names like GSK or AstraZeneca, Eli Lilly, Recursion, which is another Scottish mortgage holding. We had Chris Gibson on the podcast previously. So that's obviously a huge validation point, having these big established players partnering with you. Could you just explain what the pain point is that you're solving for these companies? Because I guess some might assume they have huge resources, huge cash piles that they can deploy into their own research and development. So what is it that Tempest offers to them that they struggle to do themselves?
Yeah, I mean, well, the very first part of it is that these companies, up until Tempest, never, at least in cancer and oncology, were never able to get the data that you would actually need to kind of add a molecular lens to the clinical trials or the studies you were running. And the reason that they couldn't do that is up until Tempest, there was some molecular data, right? Not a ton, but some, but it was just molecular data. And then there was lots of clinical data, like who are these patients and what drugs they're taking, but that was kind of over here. And so the only time people ever tried to, maybe even in small ways, marry the two is when they ran a clinical trial. So let's say I have 400 patients and I'm going to run some clinical trial, and maybe as part of the trial, I'm going to sequence those patients. So now I have 200 patients or 40 patients or 100 patients with matched clinical molecular data. There was no way to see if those 50 patients or 200 patients were representative of the millions that were in the market. And there was no way to understand if you were missing certain molecular trends because of your small sample size. And so Tempest showed up and said, look, I mean, if we're sequencing all these patients clinically, and if doctors are having a hard time understanding these results, if we get the clinical data and we put the two together, now we help doctors actually figure out what to do, but we also generate this matched clinical molecular data set that typically people would have to run a clinical trial to get, and we'll generate it at scale. So what's crazy is when Tempest had sequenced 10,000, our first year, which I think was like 2018 or something, we'd sequenced 10,000 patients, basically. And that was enough of a data set. That was our first year. We were, tiny, but that was enough of a data set to actually go to, at the time, a company called MedImmune, which was bought by AstraZeneca, and say, I've got 10,000 patients with matched clinical molecular data. Do you find any value in that? And they were like, we want 4,000. Okay, we'll take 4,000 and we'll give you $8 million or whatever it was, $6 million for, I don't remember. But, and so we're like, oh, we're onto something. And, fast forward, I don't know the exact number, but I think last quarter we may have sequenced almost 70,000 patients in one quarter. So you can, or 70,000, we ran 70,000 tests in one quarter. So you can see that as the scale has grown, and that database keeps growing. And so more and more people can pick these really micro-targeted populations. Like, I want triple negative breast cancer patients with a PIK3CA and RB1 mutation. They can't have taken an immunotherapy, so I don't want them to have like a high PD-L1 score. And they have to be females under the age of 65, and whatever. So you're kind of like almost building a clinical trial, then going to Tempest and saying, do you have those patients? And we have hundreds or thousands of them, and so that's what's unique.
So let's go on with expanding some of the point that you were making about AI and actually using this technology, the fact that it is distinct from testing, and it can be applied really broadly. And I think you've said in the past this could ultimately become Tempest's largest business. Now, I guess the starting point with AI in healthcare is that there's currently no way to pay for it. So if we use the cardiology to bring this to life, can you explain how the Tempest platform and specific tests could help predict major cardiac trauma and stroke risk?
Yeah, it's a good example. So essentially, the basic challenge. By the way, I then we can talk a little bit of how I think some of these solutions make their way to Europe and other parts of the world. But the challenge in the U.S. is we have this notion that if we were going to pay for a laboratory test result, okay, that it had to come from a lab. That, in other words, like where's the chemistry? That, and remember, these systems are very old. This is like these are 100-year-old, 200-year-old infrastructure systems, and so in terms of like payment and reimbursement and whatever, and so people began like, where's the lab? Where's the wet lab? And so when as AI began to take off in the last, let's say, 10 years, it became apparent that you actually could generate a diagnostic result or a laboratory test result with no lab at all. And of course, as in the United States, our infrastructure has a hard time figuring out how to pay for that, because in the United States, our infrastructure starts with the American Medical Association assigning what's called a CPT code, or like is this something that's medically worthy? Like, should a doctor even be able to order this thing? Then it has to go into our payment infrastructure, which is convoluted because it's half public, half private. And then someone assigns like a reimbursement for that. And so because the starting point for this is humans that get paid to do these things, they've been resistant, as you can imagine, to a world where there's no humans doing these things. It's not a great, it would be like saying, pilots get to decide if autopilot ever gets to be put in a plane. Okay, like there'd be no autopilot. So anyway, but these algorithmic diagnostics are obviously growing at scale. We at Tempest have this very large data set, so we have hundreds of these things in some stage. We have them in digital pathology, we have them in oncology, and we have a whole series in cardiology. In each disease area, because Tempest is focused on how do you bring AI to diagnostics, we have to first ask ourselves, what's the diagnostic we want to focus on? It's not the same for every disease area. So in cancer, it was clear it's genomic tests, right? We want to focus on genetic tests. But in cardiology, often the first diagnostic that gives rise to a problem is an electrocardiogram, or we refer to it as ECG here in the US. It's often referred to as an EKG in Europe. But anyway, it's essentially that, you sit on the table and the doctor puts little, stickies on you, 10 or 12 of them, and it gives this wave file of what's going on with your heart. Well, about 3% of people in the United States and probably around the world are told that they had a totally normal ECG, like things look great when they had their physical exam, and yet within a year they have a heart attack or stroke. So, obviously you and I would say to ourselves, that's a very bad test if it didn't pick up a heart attack or stroke in a patient. Well, it turns out that 3% is largely connected to a series of, let's say, 10 different kind of structural heart defects. They could be things like atrial fibrillation or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or aortic stenosis or low ejection fraction, just various things that are kind of indicative of some problem between, your heart and how blood is pumping throughout your body. And we can detect that with high fidelity. So we built a series of models to do that. We took our first, which is our atrial fibrillation model, to the FDA. It got approval. It got breakthrough designation, then it got approval, which is pretty awesome. But up until recently, there was no code to reimburse that. Now, what's amazing is CMS, which is our Medicare and Medicaid entity, issued a guidance that they were going to pay $121 for an algorithmic diagnostic that sits on top of an electrocardiogram. So all of a sudden, and we're one of the only companies in the world that has one of these things. Like we have one, and then a company connected to Mayo Clinic has one. And Mayo actually led the charge to get this thing paid for. So now we live in a world where all of a sudden, for the first time, we're like, whoa, wait a minute. Hospitals can now bill $121 to Medicare, which is about half the patients, and get paid for our algorithm. So we've been trying to figure out, how do we start working with hospitals to get this thing deployed? It's exciting, but it's all just brand new. And I think over time, these kind of models that make electrocardiograms smarter, make genetic tests smarter, make blood tests smarter, make CAT scans smarter, these will become pervasive. There will be hundreds or thousands. They will be reimbursed. And I suspect if Tempest is ever a really big company, like as big as Tesla, it's because we have lots of these models and they're being routinely reimbursed. And given what I saw a few weeks ago, I think that will happen. It's just a matter of time.
It's a really exciting thing that you're actually starting to see the value that you're creating being recognized. I think it's probably worth making the point that it's $121 to run this algorithm on top of the and on top of the ECG. But the saving to the healthcare system from paying that will be immense because of the cost of actually the care of those 3% of patients that go on to have a heart attack.
Yeah. I mean, you're paying $121 to run an algorithm, and if the patient that gets the heart attack or stroke, at least in the U.S., it costs the system about $100,000 a year. So, but how many years do they live? If you tell me they live 3 years, it's $300,000. So, the ROI is like unbelievably good.
ROI, return on investment.
Yeah, if you're the government, and by the way, our government hates paying for things. So when they decide to pay for something new, it typically means someone's done the math and they think it's very good because they know they got a problem. They're spending $5 trillion a year. I mean, our system there's nothing like it. I mean, if you look at the GDP of Europe versus the GDP of the United States, they're similar. I think, in fact, the GDP of Europe may be larger, at least it was a few years ago. But if you look at the healthcare spend in the United States, the U.S. spends as much as the next 14 largest countries combined. I mean, it's forget Europe. You're like,
Yep.
I mean, it's tiny. We have you, India, China, Japan, South Korea. I mean, just keep going. Like we literally, there's nothing like it. So it's also why at Tempest we chose to stay mostly focused on the U.S. Like if you look at Amazon realized, relatively early that it wanted to get to, Great Britain and Germany and France and Japan and whatever. But I think our attitude is if we can solve these problems in the U.S. system, which by the way is by far the most broken system, it may produce the most innovation, but we spend as much as the next 14 largest countries, and we have something like the 45th highest longevity rate. So we basically don't live longer. We're no healthier. We just spend crazy amounts of money. So we figure if we can solve this problem in the U.S., we also can then kind of create a roadmap for other countries to bring AI into their systems and generate a benefit as well.
And if you think back from a world where these AI diagnostics, these AI algorithms are the largest part of your business, what has to happen between now and then to get there? What are the unlocks that will allow that to happen?
So in our case, we have the data to build. We have the proprietary data that others don't have to build these amazing models, these algorithms that have diagnostic value. We're connected to half the hospitals in the United States, so we can distribute them rapidly. So now what has to happen is people have to agree to pay for them. We just saw the first sign of that with the CPT code for the $121 AFib algorithm. People have to agree to pay for them. And then we have to convince doctors that they should want them, right? Because we can distribute them. If doctors want them, we can distribute them pretty rapidly. And so I've always told people, like, I think Tempest will have its NVIDIA moment, this moment where people are like, wait a minute, like how big could that be? But I think I don't know if it's going to come in a year or 2 or 3 or 4, I don't know. But at some point it'll be when these models start to get paid for and ordered at scale. And we start generating like large unforeseen amounts of revenue that not only do people say, wow, where'd that come from? But they're like, how big could that be? And the answer is like, so big it's inhuman. Like in other words, like $1 trillion a year of cash flow. Like it's like, so like, I don't, how big could it be? Like, I mean, the amount of waste is inhuman. So if the company that kind of algorithmically gets rid of the waste, will likely be very, very, very big. And I suspect one day, and I don't know if Tempest will be that company, but I suspect one day there will be a Tempest-like company that is every bit as big as Apple or Google or Amazon or NVIDIA or whatever, because it will be routing, tens of millions of patients around the world to the right therapy and getting paid a small toll every time it does that.
So ahead of the podcast, I looked at the first research note that we wrote about Tempest. I think it was back in 2018. And it said if Tempest has a competitive advantage, it stems from the whole of what they do being greater than the sum of the parts. And I think when you've talked about each of your product lines, whether it's in testing, in data, and in AI algorithms, you can see that they build off one another. It's very clear that there's a platform that is the backbone of this company. So you've invested $1 billion into developing this platform over the last 10 years. It's given you considerable competitive advantage, as I think has come out from this conversation. What would it require, and how long would it take for another player to catch up with you?
By the way, I'm sorry, really quickly before we get there, I had to do the math here because I had never done the math. I just did the math right now. I'm starting to think like, what is the ROI on that AFib algorithm at $121? It just got priced a few weeks ago, so I've never done the math. So basically, net, our AFib algorithm, in the United States, the audience that should order it is about call it 10 million tests a year. Okay, so that's if 10 million tests were ordered at $121, it's basically 1.2 billion. So think of it, that's the cost of the U.S. healthcare system. If we save 3% of that population from getting a heart attack or stroke, and we can pick any number you want, but that would essentially save the system $67 billion over 3 years. So for 1.2 billion, you've got 67 billion of financial benefits. And you might say, well, let's assume it's 1%, not 3, but the ROI of these models is pretty pervasive. Okay, sorry. So the back to your current question.
No, it's a great point to make, because it really brings it to life. It is hugely valuable what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. I did the math. I was like sitting here. So I think, look, you guys were obviously a very early believer, and it's nice to have really high quality, large shareholders that have been part of the story for a while, especially when you're part of a story that is a young story, right? So, it's kind of easier when you're part of a high quality investor buys a public company when they're 15 years old. Like that's interesting, but it's really more interesting when you get an investor like Bailey Gifford, who's actually in this thing like when Tempest is 5 years old, whatever, and we're small, because we have so many assumptions that we also are making, and things that we're telling you we think are going to happen, but because we're so young, we don't really know if they're going to happen. So you have a thesis, right? You guys have your own investment thesis, and we think things are going to happen. And it's nice to be able to watch how these things unfold together and kind of learn together. I think, your thesis of Tempest is reinforced by the network effects and the benefits of each of these businesses working together in tandem was also our thesis. It just was a thesis back then. Like, we thought we could build a big data business. We did. It was, when you guys invested, it was like, tiny.
Yep.
We thought the data business would be durable. We thought that the combination of this clinical molecular data would make our tests smarter, and that would lead to more growth. More doctors would order our tests, and the more doctors ordered our tests, the more data that would be generated. The more data was generated, the more pharma would want our data, and the more they wanted our data, the more money we would make, and we could invest in making our tests smarter and smarter and smarter with technology. But all of those things were kind of unknown back then, and it's been nice to see how they really do fit together. People will say to me sometimes, you guys are doing a lot. You're sequencing patients, which in and of itself, you could just do that as a business. You have all these data products that you've built. You could just do that as a business. And now you're focused on really trying to leverage your connected ecosystem to bring AI or algorithmic diagnostics to the market at scale. And are you doing too much? And let alone, you're not only doing that in cancer, but you're trying to do that in cardiology and neurology and all this other, and not just in the United States, but also now in a few other countries. Like, maybe you're doing too much. And I say to them, you're 100% right. We're doing too much. Okay. That's not debatable, but we don't really have a choice, in much the same way that Tesla took on a lot in making its product, and Apple took on a lot in making its products. Tempest has taken on a lot in making its product. The product we really want to make is, how do you make all diagnostics AI enabled or intelligent across all major diseases, across all major geographies? And the tools we're building are those tools. So all these things we do along the way, sequencing patients, building analytic tools, working with pharma partners, these are all means to an end. The end is, every time a patient walks into a hospital or a clinic and a doctor orders some kind of test to figure out what to do, we're in the middle of that. Tempest is in the middle of that, making sure that that every decision that's made is a data-driven, high-quality decision, that we reduce errors, and we make good doctors, great doctors, and great doctors, super doctors, and that we use technology to really bring all those benefits to bear. So that's the product we're building. And it's a big product. It always was. From its earliest days, it was a lofty goal, and we're certainly, I think, 9 years in a really good spot. But the next 9 years are going to be, I think, more interesting in terms of what we can build than the last 9.
So it's the breadth of the platform. It's the ability to draw on all those things that just makes it very, very hard for. Well, I don't think anybody's even trying to compete with that. Thank you very much for your kind words about the partnership and that we've had with you, and it's something we've really valued. We've learned a lot from you over that period, and we know private companies get to choose their shareholders, and we were very lucky that you chose us. So final question from me. Where you are now, if you look forward, we close with the same question on all the podcasts. What does the world look like if Tempest succeeds?
Well, I think and again, it's a matter of time, right? If we are looking at like 5 years, 10, 25, but let's say we go forward a decade or two, and Tempest reaches its ultimate success. I think we're a major player and a major reason that people live longer and healthier lives. I think a company like Tempest has the ability to quite literally impact global survival rates of the species by a decade. So if people kind of normally live to, let's say, 75 to 80, they'll live to 85 or 90. And a company like Tempest also has the ability to improve the efficiency of the global healthcare system by 2 to 3 trillion. So what's it going to keep of that? You and I could pontificate. But it's in the hundreds of billions under any scenario. And so I think if Tempest reaches its success and becomes a company of the scale of an Apple, it's because it has global reach. It's deploying these algorithms globally. It's removing errors globally, routing patients to the right therapeutic globally, being predictive and generating molecular insights globally, and that will have a big impact because the global healthcare systems are antiquated, inefficient, produce lots of pain, lots of suffering, lots of death long before a patient should die. And so, I think this is, for me, the most exciting space, because forgetting, all the other cool things, self-driving cars and, going to Mars, whatever, what I'm, quite certain one of the near-term benefits of all of these advancements generative AI is going to be is we will be able to eradicate many, many, many diseases and many, many, many errors. And so I think Tempest can play a big part of that, and that's how you have a huge impact.
Well, obviously, as shareholders and partnering with you, we absolutely buy into that vision. Very excited to see what you can do over the next 10 years.
We're excited to have you with us.
So thank you very much, Eric, for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, Tom, I think most people, after listening to that conversation, will come away with a feeling that this is a company at the vanguard of applying artificial intelligence in healthcare, and that they are helping to support a better, smarter, faster, and crucially a more cost-effective healthcare system. I think any company saying that they could save you $67 billion over 3 years is going to make anyone kind of sit up and take notice. So, Tom, we always use this section of the podcast to give the Scottish Mortgage perspective on the company in question and kind of try and lift the bonnet and give shareholders the insight into how we're assessing the investment case. So maybe to kick off, as Eric mentioned, we were early believers into Tempest. We first invested in the summer of 2018. So Tom, can you tell us the backstory from your perspective? How did you initially come across the company, and how were we able to access it, given it was still a private company at that point?
Well, we were very interested in the idea that data could really make a difference in healthcare. We'd invested in a private company called Flatiron.
Yeah.
which had then been sold, which was looking at not the same thing, but trying to address a similar problem around data integration. And what struck us about Tempest was that you had someone in Eric who really understood technology deeply. And then through the very difficult experience he'd been through with his family, had seen the opportunity to actually deploy this technology in healthcare. Healthcare is the biggest industry in the world. It's, if you can actually, if this technology is going to be impactful in the world, then it has to be impactful in healthcare. And so that's what got us excited.
And as you say, many of the companies that we invest in have this kind of personal story, which is the motivating factor behind their vision initially. And I guess there's probably a few stories as personal as Eric's, his frustrations in the healthcare system he witnessed firsthand as his wife was diagnosed and being treated for a cancer has almost given rise to Tempest. But I think what I took away and what makes him different is that, as he said, he's not this healthcare guy. He's someone that identified a problem and was resilient enough to withstand this skepticism of, nice idea, rich guy, this isn't going to fly. And he's had that kind of tenacity and drive almost to create this amazing company. So I guess I'm interested, what were your first impressions of Eric? And what is it about him that you think has increased the odds of success for the company and the culture that he's now created around this business?
Well, as he said, he is a serial entrepreneur.
Yep.
He's been there before. He's been really successful before.
Yeah.
So he knows what it takes to build a business, and I think that seasoned entrepreneurs are really interesting when you're thinking about investing in companies. I think that one of the other things I think that will be clear from the conversation is that Eric is brilliant at articulating what he's doing, that he can cut through the jargon. And I think in healthcare particularly, people drown in jargon. So actually being able to clearly state what the company is trying to do and get people to buy into that vision.
Yeah.
Because he raised capital really efficiently as a private company, found shareholders who are aligned with the vision for what he wanted to do. And I think that's been a really important part of enabling the company's success to date.
And that kind of ability to articulate, I thought his comparison to Tesla was really quite insightful. Comparing Tesla to another EV, saying, they both have four wheels, they both use a battery, and they get you from A to B. But it's that kind of technological advantage that Tesla has that makes it unique. And he sort of said Tempest is similar from that perspective. But Tom, I'm interested in your opinion. What's, for you, did you identify as the competitive edge, or how has it evolved, especially with the advances in AI that we've seen, particularly over the last kind of 2 to 3 years?
Well, today, you would say that Tempest is a diagnostics business.
Yeah.
But and that's where the largest proportion of its revenues come from running these diagnostic genomic testing services. But actually, I would see it as a data company, and the diagnostic testing is the on-ramp. It's the way of getting hold of the data. But the whole premise right from the start is, how do we do things more effectively with data? How do we get it to the right people? How do we find out what's important in it? And if you to steal another analogy, one of the things that we always liked about Amazon was that the technology that powered its storefront got more powerful and cheaper every year.
Yeah.
And I think you have a similar dynamic at play with Tempest. We weren't talking about AI in back when we first invested in the way that we're talking about it today. But the tools that are available are just getting more and more powerful. And so if you've got that data footprint in order, if you have that resource, then it's so much easier for you to run these AI algorithms to generate the insights that come from that than it is for a company whose background is in simply running tests. And
so it's clear a lot of the stars have aligned for Tempest, and Eric alluded to this. The cost of genomic sequencing has been falling. You've got now low cost and scalable cloud computing. You've seen advances in machine learning. So there are big tailwinds, behind the company. But Tom, perhaps put a different hat on for a second. What do you consider as the key kind of threats from here for Tempest? What do you think is the most significant, and how do you think Tempest are placed to overcome them from here on in?
Well, I think probably the first one is really simple, that this is a healthcare company. Mm-hmm. And the US healthcare system in particular is an incredibly complex system, which where the incentives don't necessarily align with what you would expect in terms of patient outcomes. You can see that in the way that tests are paid for, where you get funding. So I think the outlook for the system as a whole is really important, and it won't necessarily follow economically predictable rationale. Yeah. So I think that's a challenge. And then the other part of that's intrinsic to working in the healthcare industry is you need the regulator to approve what you're doing. Yeah. And so you can deploy AI algorithms, AI systems really quickly in other industries, but here you need that seal of approval, and rightly so from a safety standpoint. But I think the question there for me is, to what extent is that a constraint on how quickly Tempest can move?
And just sort of following on from that then, Tom, we spent a lot of time thinking about the scale of the opportunity for our companies. And Eric was framing the opportunity for Tempest in terms of the potential savings to the US healthcare system. And it was kind of mind-blowing when he said what the US spends on healthcare is something like the next 14 countries combined. And so I think what became clear when you were listening to him was just how the power of this technology is delivering kind of real value to these healthcare systems. So when you think about the opportunity available to Tempest, what do you think the likelihood you put on them capitalizing on this opportunity and them, using his phrase, having their NVIDIA moment, if you like, as he calls it, over the next kind of 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think that this comes back a little bit to what you were talking about tailwinds. Yeah. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. But if the technology that you're doing your testing with is getting better and cheaper, if the data that you can collect is getting more precise, more comprehensive, if you're able to connect that in more and more places, and if AI, what AI systems are capable of, both from an algorithm point of view, but also from the hardware point of view, the progress of like NVIDIA, what we can say with some confidence is that all of these ingredients will become more and more powerful over the next few years. Yeah. And that's a really good position for a business to be in. Now, how they capitalize on it, what the specifics are, which areas the algorithms turn out to be really good at saving cost in or saving lives in, we don't know exactly how that's going to play out. But we do know that as your articulation of it suggests, that this is a system where there is huge cost, and if you can make it just that little bit more efficient, then that is your revenue opportunity.
Well, I think that feels like a pretty good note to end on. So, Tom, as always, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So a huge thank you to Tom and Eric for that fascinating discussion. Coming up over the next few episodes, we welcome 2 new holdings to the Scottish Mortgage portfolio. We sit down with a co-founder of Nubank, the Latin American digital banking giant, and we also welcome the founder of Horizon Robotics, a Chinese company developing AI and robotic solutions for autonomous driving. Subscribe now to be the first to hear when these episodes go live. You've been listening to Invest in Progress. Thank you for joining us. Unlisted investments, such as private companies in which the trust has a significant investment, can increase risk. These assets may be more difficult to sell, so changes in their prices may be greater.